Ethan Carter was a man of resilience, courage, and strength, traits that defined him not only as a police officer but also as a husband and father. Yet no amount of training or preparedness could shield him from the tragic turn his life would take on a fateful winter evening. The ringing of the phone cut through the quiet hum of his precinct. The voice on the other end delivered a message that made the ground beneath him shift. "Mr. Carter, there's been an accident." Ethan's wife, Grace, and their 13-year-old daughter, Sophie, were involved in a head-on collision caused by a drunk driver. Grace's injuries were fatal. Sophie, though alive, was left in a critical condition, her fragile body teetering between life and death in a hospital bed. A coma enveloped her, a cruel barrier between her and the world she once knew. When Ethan arrived at the hospital, it felt as if time slowed. The sterile white walls seemed to close in on him. A nurse tried to explain Sophie's condition, but her words were muffled by the deafening echo of his grief. He stared at his daughter through the glass window of her ICU room, her small frame overwhelmed by the tangle of wires and machines that now sustained her life. His heart broke again and again as he traced the bruises on her face, the innocence stolen from her without warning. For Grace, there was no such vigil to hold. She was already gone. The woman who had been his anchor, his partner, the mother of his child, was now a memory. Ethan had seen death before in his line of duty, but never this close, never this personal. Days turned into weeks, but the weight of his grief did not lessen. At home, he moved through the motions of living like a ghost. Sophie's room remained untouched, her schoolbook still open on her desk, as if she would walk through the door at any moment. The sight of her favorite stuffed animal, perched on her bed, brought him to tears more times than he could count. Ethan's relationship with the world outside his home began to fray. Neighbors whispered about him, their pity-laden stares following him whenever he ventured out. Some offered condolences, their words hollow and perfunctory, while others avoided him entirely, unsure of how to approach a man shattered by tragedy. At work, his once steadfast reputation was overshadowed by his grief. His colleagues were patient, but there were limits to their understanding. Ethan often found himself snapping at them, the weight of his pain manifesting in ways he could not control. The drunk driver responsible for the crash, a man named Darren Price, became the focal point of Ethan's anguish. Darren had survived the crash with only minor injuries and was quickly arrested. Ethan sat through the court hearings, seething as the defense painted Darren as a man who had made a mistake, a lapse in judgment. To Ethan, it was much more than that. Darren had stolen his wife, robbed his daughter of her childhood, and reduced his life to an endless ache. The sentencing brought little solace. 10 years in prison felt like an insult compared to the lifetime of pain Ethan now faced. Nights were the hardest. In the silence of his home, with only the hum of Sophie's medical updates to pierce the stillness, Ethan found himself drowning in memories of Grace. Her voice, her touch, the way she smiled, it was all gone. He took to sleeping on the couch, unable to bear the emptiness of their shared bed. When sleep came, it was often plagued with nightmares. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, the image of Sophie's motionless body haunting him. As weeks turned into months, the world around him moved on, but Ethan remained stuck in the purgatory of his loss. He tried therapy, but the words of the counselor felt like platitudes, inadequate to bridge the chasm of his pain. Support groups offered a temporary balm, but he could not bring himself to open up to strangers about the depth of his sorrow. Through it all, Sophie remained in the coma, her body alive but her essence seemingly unreachable. Every visit to the hospital was a mix of hope and despair. He held her hand, talking to her about the things she loved, even though he knew she could not hear him. Nurses and doctors offered kind words, but their eyes betrayed the uncertainty of her prognosis. Ethan lived in a perpetual state of limbo, his days defined by the sterile beeping of machines and the cruel passage of time. Ethan's once unshakable faith in justice and humanity was now a fragile thread. Grace's death and Sophie's coma were not just tragedies, they were assaults on everything he believed in. He carried an unrelenting guilt, questioning every decision he had made leading up to the crash. What if he had insisted on driving that night? What if he had been there? The what-ifs consumed him, an unending cycle of self-recrimination. The man who once faced danger with unflinching resolve now struggled to find a reason to wake up each day. The laughter and light that Grace and Sophie had brought into his life were gone, replaced by a shadow that threatened to engulf him entirely. Ethan was no longer just grieving, he was lost, a man untethered from the life he once knew. And as he sat by Sophie's bedside, gripping her hand as if his touch alone could bring her back, he whispered a silent plea to the universe. A plea for a miracle, a second chance to reclaim the family that had been so cruelly taken from him. Ethan Carter sat at the kitchen table, staring at a mug of untouched coffee. The silence of his home was broken only by the occasional thump of Shadow's tail against the hardwood floor. His service dog, a sleek black German shepherd, sat dutifully at his side, amber eyes fixed on his handler. Shadow had been a gift from the department after Grace's death, a companion meant to help Ethan navigate the tidal waves of grief and anxiety that now consumed him. Yet even Shadow's unwavering loyalty couldn't fill the void. The knock at the door startled Ethan out of his daze. He glanced at the clock. It was barely 8 a.m. He wasn't expecting anyone. Shadow, ever vigilant, stood and trotted to the door, his ears perked. Ethan rose slowly, his movements heavy, and opened the door to find Captain Emily Brooks standing on his porch. Emily was a force of nature. Her sharp brown eyes were framed by the lines of a woman who had seen too much but refused to let it break her. She had been Ethan's captain for over a decade and had earned his respect through her unyielding sense of duty. Today, she looked both determined and weary. "Morning, Ethan," she said briskly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She glanced around the dimly lit living room, her gaze lingering on the half-packed boxes and cluttered surfaces. "Emily," Ethan greeted, his voice rough from disuse. "What brings you here?" She turned to face him, her hands on her hips. "You do?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "If this is about coming back to work—" "It is," Emily interrupted. "And you're going to listen?" He opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand. "You're not the only one who's been through hell, Ethan. But sitting in this house, wallowing in grief, isn't helping you or Sophie." Her words hit like a slap, but before he could respond, she softened her tone. "Look, I'm not here to guilt-trip you. I'm here because I know you. You're a damn good cop, and you still have a lot to offer. The department needs you. And Shadow, he needs you to give him a purpose. He's not just a pet, Ethan. He's trained to work, just like you are." Ethan looked down at Shadow, who was now sitting patiently by his feet, his tail wagging slightly as if he understood the conversation. Emily pressed on, her voice steady. "We've got a situation. An armed suspect at the Northside Mall. It's escalating fast, and we need every available hand. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't serious." The mention of the mall sent a ripple of unease through Ethan. It was a bustling hub of activity, a place where families gathered, where his own family had once spent weekends. He hesitated, torn between the pull of duty and the crushing weight of his personal losses. Emily stepped closer, her gaze intense. "Ethan, I know you're hurting. But you can either let this pain consume you, or you can use it. You took an oath to serve and protect. That hasn't changed." After a long pause, Ethan nodded. "All right, let me get my gear." The drive to the mall was tense. Ethan sat in the passenger seat of the squad car, Shadow's head resting on his lap. Emily drove with a calm precision that belied the urgency of their destination. The radio crackled with updates from the scene: multiple hostages, a heavily armed suspect, and a volatile situation teetering on the brink of disaster. As they pulled into the parking lot, the chaos was palpable. Patrol cars were scattered across the lot, their lights casting an eerie glow on the surrounding area. Officers were huddled behind vehicles, their weapons drawn, while civilians milled about in various states of panic. The air was thick with tension. Ethan stepped out of the car, his senses sharpening as adrenaline began to override his lingering fatigue. Shadow stayed close to his side, his body taut with anticipation. Emily approached the incident commander, a wiry sergeant named Morales, who quickly briefed them on the situation. "The suspect's barricaded himself in the food court," Morales explained, his voice low and urgent. He's armed with an AR-15 and has taken about 20 hostages, mostly shoppers and mall staff. He's already fired a few warning shots. SWAT's on their way, but they're at least 20 minutes out. Ethan's jaw tightened. Any demands? Morales shook his head. Not yet. He's just shouting incoherently about taking back control, and, well, it's not pretty. He's targeting minorities, specifically the mall workers. Called one of them a dirty immigrant before firing into the ceiling. This guy's unhinged. Ethan's stomach churned with a mix of anger and dread. The racism added a layer of venom to an already dangerous situation. He glanced at Emily, who nodded subtly. They both knew they couldn't wait for SWAT. The risk to the hostages was too great. All right, Ethan said, his voice steady. Let's move. Inside the mall, the air was stifling. The distant sound of the suspect's voice echoed through the cavernous space, interspersed with the muffled cries of the hostages. Ethan and Shadow moved with practiced precision, using the maze of storefronts and kiosks for cover. Emily followed close behind, her radio clipped to her vest for updates. As they approached the food court, Ethan signaled for Shadow to halt. The dog crouched low, his ears swiveling as he picked up the suspect's erratic movements. Peering around the corner, Ethan spotted the man, a middle-aged white male with a scruffy beard and wild eyes. He paced back and forth, waving his rifle and shouting obscenities. The hostages were huddled together near the counter of a burger joint, their faces pale with fear. Among them was a young woman in a hijab, her hands clasped tightly around the shoulders of a sobbing child. The sight filled Ethan with a cold fury. Ethan activated his radio, speaking in a low voice. We have eyes on the suspect. Approximate distance, 50 feet. Hostages are grouped to the right. Suspect is highly agitated. Emily responded, her tone calm. Understood. Do you have a clear shot? Negative, Ethan replied. Too many civilians in the line of fire. He took a deep breath, formulating a plan. Shadow's training as a service and protection dog could be the key to ending this standoff without further bloodshed. Emily, Ethan said quietly, I'm sending Shadow in as a distraction. Be ready to move when I give the signal. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Copy that. Ethan knelt beside Shadow, giving the dog a series of hand signals. Shadow's ears perked up, his body tense with readiness. Ethan whispered a single word, go. Shadow darted into the food court, his sleek form a blur of motion. The suspect turned, startled, as the dog barked sharply, drawing his attention away from the hostages. In that split second, Ethan and Emily sprang into action. Ethan fired a precise shot, striking the suspect's weapon and sending it clattering to the floor. Before the man could react, Shadow lunged, knocking him to the ground and pinning him with a growl that left no room for resistance. Emily moved swiftly to secure the rifle while Ethan cuffed the suspect, his movements efficient and controlled. The hostages erupted into relieved sobs and cheers as officers flooded the scene to assist. Ethan stood over the subdued suspect, his chest heaving with adrenaline. Shadow returned to his side, his tail wagging as if to say, job well done. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a flicker of purpose. He looked at Emily, who gave him a small, knowing smile. Welcome back, Carter. The suspect, Nathan Reed, sat in the interrogation room, his disheveled appearance amplified by the fluorescent lights. His hands, cuffed tightly to the metal table, trembled slightly, though whether from adrenaline, anger, or despair, Ethan Carter couldn't tell. The room reeked of stale sweat and unspoken rage. Shadow sat by Ethan's side, alert but calm, his amber eyes fixed on Reed as though sensing the tension in the room. Ethan had watched the initial questioning from behind the glass, listening as Reed alternated between silence and bursts of venomous tirades. The man's voice was raw with anguish, spewing racist slurs and rants about the decline of society. The rhetoric was familiar, Ethan had encountered it before in his line of work, but there was something else beneath the vitriol, a hollow pain that hinted at a deeper, unresolved torment. The arrest at the mall had been clean, thanks in no small part to Shadow's precision. But the aftermath was messy. The media had descended on the scene like vultures, amplifying every detail of Reed's diatribe. The public outcry was swift and polarized. Ethan couldn't escape the noise, but in the quiet of his own thoughts, he focused on one goal: finding a way to end the cycle of violence Reed had started. Captain Emily Brooks appeared in the observation room, her expression a mix of weariness and determination. "You think you can get through to him?" Ethan nodded slowly. "He's broken, Emily. Beneath all that hate, there's something else. We need to find it." Emily studied him for a moment before placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're the best we've got. But watch yourself in there." Ethan pushed open the door to the interrogation room. Reed's bloodshot eyes snapped up, narrowing as he took in the sight of Ethan and Shadow. "Here to play the hero cop?" Reed sneered, his voice laced with disdain. Ethan ignored the jab, pulling out the chair opposite Reed. He motioned for Shadow to sit at his side. The dog obeyed, his presence a quiet assurance of control. "I'm here to talk," Ethan said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "No cameras, no lawyers, just you and me." Reed laughed bitterly. "What's the point? You've already decided I'm a monster, right? Just another crazy white guy with a gun." "You tell me," Ethan replied. "Is that who you are?" Reed leaned back in his chair, his shackles clinking against the table. "Does it matter? People like me don't get second chances." Ethan tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. "Everyone has a story, Nathan. Even you. So why don't you tell me yours?" For a moment, Reed said nothing, his jaw clenched tightly. But then his shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him like air from a balloon. "They're gone," he said finally, his voice breaking. "My wife, my kids, all gone." Ethan's heart tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "What happened?" Reed hesitated, his eyes darting to the corner of the room as if searching for an escape. When he spoke again, his words came in a torrent. "My wife left me 6 months ago. Took the kids and filed for divorce. She said I was too angry, too bitter. I tried to tell her I'd change, but she didn't believe me. Then last month," he swallowed hard, his voice cracking. "They were hit by a drunk driver. All of them. Gone in an instant." Ethan felt a pang of recognition, the parallels to his own loss cutting deeper than he expected. He leaned forward, his tone softening. "I'm sorry, Nathan. I know what it's like to lose everything." Reed's eyes narrowed. "What would you know about it? You're just another cop, pretending to care." Ethan took a deep breath. "My wife died in a car accident. Drunk driver, just like yours. My daughter survived, but she's in a coma. Every day, I sit by her bed, wondering if she'll ever wake up. So, yeah, I know what it feels like to lose the people you love." Reed stared at him, his anger momentarily eclipsed by shock. "You're serious?" Ethan nodded. "Dead serious. And let me tell you something, Nathan, this pain you're feeling? It doesn't go away. But it doesn't have to define you either." Reed looked down at the table, his hands trembling. "I tried to keep it together," he muttered. "But the hate, it was the only thing that kept me going. I blamed everyone. Immigrants, politicians, the system. I needed someone to hate, or I'd have nothing." Ethan's voice hardened slightly. "And that hate almost cost more lives today. Those people at the mall didn't take your family away, Nathan. But you were ready to destroy theirs." Reed's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mix of guilt and defiance. "I didn't mean to hurt them. I just wanted someone to listen." "They're listening now," Ethan said. "But this isn't the way, Nathan. Violence doesn't bring them back. It just leaves more people grieving, more families shattered." Reed's breathing grew ragged, his emotions bubbling to the surface. Shadow shifted slightly, sensing the rising tension. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's back, grounding himself as much as the situation. "You don't have to carry this alone," Ethan continued. "There's a way forward, but you have to choose it. Surrender now, and we can get you the help you need. But if you keep letting this hate consume you, it'll destroy you." For a long moment, Reed said nothing. Then, with a shaky breath, he nodded. "All right, I'm done. I'll cooperate." Ethan stood slowly, signaling for the officers outside to enter. Shadow remained by his side, a silent enforcer of calm. As they secured Reed's cuffs and prepared to transport him, the man looked at Ethan one last time. Do you think they'd forgive me? He asked quietly. Ethan met his gaze, his voice steady. I think forgiveness starts with you, Nathan. It's not easy, but it's worth it. As Reed was led away, Ethan felt an unexpected sense of closure. The wounds of his own loss were far from healed, but in helping Reed take the first step toward redemption, he found a glimmer of purpose amidst the darkness. Shadow nudged his leg, breaking his reverie. Ethan knelt beside the dog, scratching behind his ears. Good job, buddy, he murmured. Together, they walked out of the room, ready to face whatever came next. The air inside the hospital room was thick with a suffocating stillness. The rhythmic beeping of Sophie's heart monitor had become an unwelcome lullaby, a constant reminder of the limbo she had been trapped in for months. Ethan Carter sat slumped in the chair by her bedside, Shadow lying at his feet, ever vigilant. The day's events, the confrontation with Nathan Reed, the tension of the mall incident, had drained him, but the sight of Sophie, motionless and pale, was an exhaustion that words couldn't capture. Ethan reached out and gently took Sophie's hand in his, her fingers so small and delicate in his calloused grip. He'd lost count of the days he had spent in this room, hoping, praying, bargaining with whatever higher power might be listening. He looked at her face, searching for any sign of life beyond the machines keeping her alive. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, mechanical movements, a stark contrast to the vibrant energy she once carried. Shadow stirred, lifting his head to look at Sophie as if he, too, was willing her to wake. Ethan ran a hand over the dog's sleek fur, finding solace in the loyal presence by his side. Shadow had been more than a service dog. He had become a lifeline, a connection to the world outside the walls of grief that threatened to consume Ethan. Still hanging in there, huh, buddy? Ethan murmured to Shadow, who thumped his tail softly against the floor. The dog's unwavering gaze was fixed on Sophie, his instincts tuned to the fragile girl who had become his second handler in spirit, even if she hadn't yet woken to claim the role. Ethan leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't sleep much these days. When he did, the nightmares were relentless. Images of Grace flashed before him, her laughter, the warmth of her embrace, and then the cruel reality of her absence. And Sophie, the guilt clawed at him daily. What if he hadn't let them go out that night? What if he had driven instead? The what-ifs were an endless loop in his mind, a torment he couldn't escape. The sound of the door opening jolted him upright. A nurse entered, her shoes squeaking lightly on the linoleum floor. It was Maria, one of Sophie's regular caregivers. She smiled kindly at Ethan, though her eyes betrayed a familiar pity he had grown to loathe. Still here, Mr. Carter, Maria said softly as she checked Sophie's vitals. Where else would I be? Ethan replied, his voice rough. Maria glanced at Shadow, who was now sitting upright, his ears pricked. He's quite the guardian, she said. Never seen a dog so dedicated. Ethan managed a faint smile. He's a good boy. Don't know how I'd get through this without him. Maria nodded, finishing her check. She's stable. That's a good sign. Just keep talking to her. It helps more than you'd think. After she left, Ethan sighed heavily and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Hey, kiddo, he said softly, his voice catching in his throat. It's me, Dad. He paused, swallowing the lump that had formed. I need you to come back to me, Sophie. I know it's hard. I know you're probably scared, but I'm here. Shadow's here. We're not going anywhere. Shadow stood and placed his front paws gently on the edge of Sophie's bed, his nose nuzzling her hand. Ethan watched, his chest tightening as he saw the faintest twitch of her fingers. His heart leapt. Sophie, he said, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and disbelief. The room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, her fingers moved again, a tentative, almost imperceptible motion. Ethan shot to his feet, his hand gently cradling hers. Sophie, sweetheart, it's Dad. Can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered, the movement so faint Ethan almost thought he imagined it. But then her lips parted, and a soft, raspy sound escaped, a sound that made his knees nearly buckle. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. I'm here, baby. I'm right here. Shadow let out a quiet whine, his tail wagging furiously as he stayed by Sophie's side. The movement drew the attention of a passing doctor, who rushed into the room, followed by Maria. She's responding, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. The doctor quickly assessed Sophie, his expression shifting from professional focus to astonished relief. This is remarkable, he said. She's starting to come out of the coma. Ethan stepped back, allowing the medical team to work. Shadow stayed rooted to the spot, his gaze never leaving Sophie. The nurses and doctors exchanged looks of awe as they watched the dog's unwavering dedication. This is something else, Maria murmured. I've seen therapy dogs, service dogs, but this one, he's special. The room buzzed with activity as Sophie's condition was monitored and stabilized. Ethan stood in the corner, his hands trembling as he tried to process what was happening. Shadow eventually moved to sit beside him, leaning against Ethan's leg as if to offer support. Hours passed, and Sophie's awakening continued in small, steady increments. She opened her eyes fully for the first time, blinking against the harsh light. Her gaze landed on Ethan, then on Shadow, and a weak smile tugged at her lips. Shadow, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan chuckled through his tears. Yeah, kiddo. He's been keeping your spot warm. The medical staff rotated in and out, their optimism infectious. Word of Sophie's recovery spread quickly, and more nurses and doctors stopped by to witness the girl who had defied the odds. Shadow's presence became a point of fascination, his constant attention to Sophie sparking conversations about the power of human-animal connections. As night fell, Ethan sat once more by Sophie's bedside, his exhaustion replaced by a tentative hope. He stroked Shadow's head, the dog now lying at Sophie's feet, his body stretched protectively along the length of her bed. You did good, buddy, Ethan whispered. We're a team, right? Shadow let out a soft huff, his eyes closing as he finally allowed himself to rest. Ethan looked at Sophie, her eyes now half closed as sleep claimed her once more. But this time, it was a healing sleep, one that promised the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to hope. The house that once felt like a mausoleum began to stir with life again. Sophie's recovery, while slow and arduous, brought a renewed sense of purpose to Ethan Carter's world. The first days after her awakening were a whirlwind of medical tests and cautious optimism. Her voice, weak and raspy, grew stronger each day as she relearned the simple joys of speech. Ethan spent every moment he could by her side, his dedication mirrored by Shadow, who seemed to understand the gravity of his role. Sophie's physical therapy sessions became a central focus of their days. Her body, weakened from months of immobility, needed to rebuild its strength. The hospital's therapy room, bright and airy, became Sophie's battleground. Shadow was always present, his sleek form a comforting shadow beside her as she worked through the exercises. He acted as both motivator and partner, fetching therapy balls, walking beside her during balance drills, and even providing a steady point of support when her legs faltered. Come on, Shadow, Sophie said one afternoon, her voice filled with determination as she held onto a set of parallel bars. We've got this, right? Shadow barked softly, his tail wagging as if to encourage her. Ethan stood nearby, his arms crossed but his face softened with pride. Watching Sophie take those first shaky steps was a moment he would never forget. It was as though he could see Grace's spirit in their daughter's resilience, her refusal to give in to the pain and adversity. The local community began to rally around the Carters in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. The neighbors who once offered only awkward condolences started showing up with genuine offers of help. Groceries were dropped off, the lawn was mowed without being asked, and a local church group even organized a meal train to ensure Ethan and Sophie didn't have to worry about dinner during her recovery. One afternoon, a knock at the door revealed a group of high school students standing awkwardly on the porch, holding a large card and a basket of baked goods. Sophie, now able to sit in her wheelchair at the front window, watched with curiosity as Ethan opened the door. Hi, Mr. Carter, one of the boys stammered. We're from Sophie's school. We heard about what happened and wanted to, let you know we're all rooting for her. Ethan's throat tightened as he took the card, a massive construction paper creation filled with colorful drawings and messages of encouragement. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means a lot to us." Behind him, Sophie smiled shyly and waved. The kids waved back enthusiastically, their awkwardness melting away. The police department also stepped up in ways Ethan hadn't expected. Captain Emily Brooks spearheaded an initiative to raise funds for Sophie's therapy, organizing a charity 5K run that drew participation from officers, their families, and the broader community. Shadow became the event's unofficial mascot, his image plastered on flyers and t-shirts. The day of the run was unseasonably warm, and Ethan found himself overwhelmed by the turnout. Officers who had served alongside him, strangers from the community, and even local business owners had come to show their support. Sophie, still too weak to walk long distances, was wheeled to the starting line by Ethan, with Shadow trotting proudly beside them. "Dad," Sophie whispered, gripping his hand, "look at all these people." Ethan's gaze swept over the crowd, his chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and awe. "They're here for you, sophomore. Because they believe in you." When the race began, Ethan and Sophie stayed behind, cheering on the participants. Shadow wagged his tail furiously as runners passed by, many stopping briefly to give him a pat or wave to Sophie. By the end of the event, thousands of dollars had been raised, enough to cover months of specialized therapy equipment. Sophie's progress became the centerpiece of Ethan's rebuilding efforts. Each milestone she achieved felt like a small victory in their battle against the weight of their loss. She transitioned from the wheelchair to a walker, her confidence growing with each step she took. Shadow, ever faithful, became her constant companion in these moments, his presence a source of comfort and motivation. At home, Sophie began to reclaim her life. Her laughter, once absent, began to echo through the halls again. Ethan often caught her talking to Shadow in the evenings, sharing stories about school and dreams for the future as though he were her closest confidant. But the scars of their shared trauma weren't easily erased. Ethan struggled with his own demons, often retreating to the solitude of his room late at night to grapple with the weight of his guilt. It was in these quiet moments that Shadow would find him, resting his head on Ethan's knee and grounding him in the present. "Thanks, buddy," Ethan would whisper, his voice barely audible over the hum of the house. Shadow's unwavering gaze seemed to say, "You're not alone." As Sophie grew stronger, she became more outspoken about the racial slurs she had endured during her recovery. She had overheard comments from staff and patients alike, remarks about her mixed heritage, her darker skin tone, and her place in a predominantly white community. It was a bitter reminder that while the community's support was real, prejudice lingered in the cracks. One day, as Sophie practiced walking in the park, a passerby made a snide comment under his breath about Shadow's presence near a foreign girl. Ethan froze, his fists clenching instinctively, but Sophie stopped him with a hand on his arm. "It's okay, Dad," she said firmly. "They don't matter." Her resilience stunned Ethan, but it also ignited a deeper fire in him. He knew he couldn't shield Sophie from the world's ugliness, but he could ensure she never faced it alone. Together, they began attending community meetings focused on racial inclusivity, using their story as a platform to push for change. The Carter family's journey was far from over, but the cracks in their foundation had begun to heal. Ethan returned to work part-time, reintegrating into the department with Shadow at his side. Sophie, now walking unassisted, began attending school again, her classmates welcoming her back with open arms. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Sophie sat on the porch with Shadow between them. The air was warm, filled with the chirping of crickets and the faint hum of distant traffic. "You know," Sophie said, her voice thoughtful, "I think Mom would be proud of us." Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he said softly. "She would." Shadow let out a contented sigh, resting his head on Sophie's lap. In that moment, the Carter family found a quiet peace, a fragile but undeniable hope that life, despite its hardships, was worth fighting for. The morning sunlight spilled through the Carter home's windows, illuminating a dining room that had begun to feel alive again. Sophie sat at the table, her textbooks spread out before her, the corners dog-eared and worn from hours of use. She was determined, more than Ethan had seen her in years. Her recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, but it was her renewed sense of purpose that filled him with awe. Shadow lay beside her, his head resting on his paws but his eyes always on Sophie, as if guarding her even in these quiet moments. Ethan watched from the kitchen, sipping his coffee and marveling at how far they had come. It wasn't just Sophie's physical progress, it was the way her spirit seemed to shine despite everything they had endured. "Dad," Sophie called out, breaking him from his thoughts. "Yeah, kiddo?" he asked, walking over to her. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but her eyes searching his face. "I want to do what you do." Ethan blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "What I do?" She nodded, her determination unwavering. "I want to become a K9 handler. Like you. I want to help people, like Shadow helped me." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure whether to feel pride or fear. The idea of his daughter stepping into the dangerous world of law enforcement, especially after everything they had been through, was almost too much to process. But as he looked at her, he saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had driven Grace to excel in everything she did. "Sophie, that's a big decision," he said carefully, sitting down across from her. "Being a K9 handler isn't just about loving dogs. It's dangerous work." "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But I want to make a difference, Dad. I want to help people the way you and Shadow do. I don't want what happened to Mom, or to me, to define us. I want to take that pain and turn it into something good." Ethan sat back, studying her. She wasn't the fragile girl he had once worried over. She was growing into a strong, resilient young woman. And though the thought of her facing the dangers of the job terrified him, he couldn't ignore the pride swelling in his chest. "If this is what you want," he said finally, "I'll support you. But you're going to have to work hard. Harder than you've ever worked before." Sophie smiled, relief washing over her face. "I'm ready to. I'll do whatever it takes." The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Sophie began shadowing Ethan at the precinct, learning the ins and outs of K9 work. Shadow became her unofficial mentor, accompanying her during training sessions and helping her understand the nuances of working with a service dog. "Shadow's spoiled you," Ethan teased one afternoon as Sophie practiced giving commands. Shadow, ever obedient, performed each task with precision, his tail wagging proudly. "He's just showing me how it's done," Sophie shot back with a grin. The officers at the precinct took notice of Sophie's dedication. Captain Emily Brooks, who had been a constant source of support for the Carters, arranged for Sophie to attend a weekend ride-along program with the K9 unit. "She's got the drive," Emily said to Ethan one evening as they watched Sophie work with Shadow in the training yard. "And the heart. She's going to be good at this." Ethan nodded, though his protective instincts gnawed at him. "I just hope it's enough to keep her safe." "She's stronger than you give her credit for," Emily replied. "And she's got you. And Shadow." As Sophie's confidence grew, so did her resolve to confront the uglier sides of the world she was stepping into. She had experienced firsthand the sting of prejudice and the systemic challenges that came with it. During her training sessions, she often heard the whispers, comments from some officers who doubted her abilities or dismissed her as a charity case. One day, after overhearing a particularly cutting remark about her heritage, Sophie confronted Ethan. "Dad, do you think people like me even belong in this line of work?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and vulnerability. Ethan's face hardened. He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sophie, listen to me. The fact that you're asking that question proves you belong. The world is full of people who will try to tear you down, but the work we do, helping people, saving lives, it's bigger than them. Don't let their ignorance dictate your worth." Sophie nodded, her resolve returning. "I won't. I don't want to let you down." "You could never let me down," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You've already made me prouder than I ever thought I could be." The day Sophie officially joined the K9 training program was a milestone for the Carter family. Ethan stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, as she signed the paperwork. Shadow, now considered something of a legend at the precinct, sat proudly at her feet. The local community, who had come to admire Sophie's resilience, celebrated the news. Neighbors stopped by with congratulatory messages, and the police department organized a small ceremony to recognize Sophie's achievement. "She's going to do great things," Emily said to Ethan during the event, her voice filled with certainty. "She already has," Ethan replied, his eyes fixed on his daughter as she laughed with Shadow by her side. As Sophie settled into her new role, the Carter household began to feel whole again. Grace's absence was still deeply felt, but her memory had become a source of strength rather than sorrow. Ethan and Sophie often spoke of her, sharing stories and remembering the lessons she had taught them. One evening, as the family sat together on the porch, Sophie turned to Ethan. "Do you think Mom would be proud of me?" she asked softly. Ethan's throat tightened, but he nodded. "She'd be more than proud, sophomore. She'd be over the moon. You're everything she ever wanted you to be." Shadow, lying at their feet, let out a contented sigh. Sophie reached down to scratch behind his ears, her smile soft but full of determination. "I want to make her proud every day," she said. "You already are," Ethan replied, his voice steady. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a golden glow, the Carter family found peace in their shared purpose. Together, with Shadow as their ever-loyal guardian, they moved forward, not just surviving, but thriving, carrying Grace's memory with them into a future full of promise.